Glasgow calls itself a city reborn. For the men in this list, it was a hunting ground, a city where heroin moved through ice cream vans, 952 blocks of cocaine inside a cargo of bananas, and a crime boss arrested in Bali for running a transnational drug empire. These are the stories of Glasgow's most notorious gangsters. Section 1. Arthur Thompson Sr. The Godfather Springburn sits in the north of Glasgow, a district that once lived and breathed heavy industry. And Arthur Thompson grew up inside it, knowing exactly what kind of place it was. His father worked in steel. The neighborhood was the kind of place that taught you, early, that the only things separating a man from nothing were his reputation and his willingness to defend it with force. Thompson absorbed that lesson before most children had finished school, and he spent the rest of his life applying it with a consistency and a brutality that eventually made him the most powerful criminal figure Scotland has ever produced. He was not flashy. He was not loud. He ran 30 years of organized crime in Glasgow through the same qualities that any successful businessman would recognize: patience, discipline, a long memory, and an absolute refusal to absorb a loss without making someone pay for it. He started as a moneylender. That origin matters more than it might seem, because lending money at punishing rates of interest to people who had no other option gave Thompson something very specific: leverage. A man who owes you money is not just a debtor, he is a liability, a resource, and when necessary, a lesson. Thompson was reported to nail those who failed to repay him to the floors or doors of their homes. The accounts differ in detail but align on substance. This was not random sadism, it was communication, directed at everyone who heard about it afterward. A man who did that to one borrower never had to do it to the next 10. The loans kept flowing, the interest kept accumulating, and Thompson's reputation moved ahead of him through Glasgow's working-class neighborhoods like a standing wave. By the time he had built that reputation into something solid, he had moved on to protection rackets, extracting payments from pubs, businesses, and anyone else operating in territory he considered his. The rackets fed back into the lending fed the rackets, and the whole machine grew steadily through the 1950s and into the 1960s. In 1966, someone put a bomb under Thompson's car. The device detonated, but Thompson himself survived. His mother-in-law, riding with him, did not. The explosion killed her. A lesser man might have retreated, reconsidered, found a quieter line of work. Thompson did the opposite. He identified 2 men he believed were responsible, members of the Welsh family from his own neighborhood of Blackhill, and he forced their van off the road by driving his own car directly into it. Both men, Patrick Welsh and James Goldie, died in the crash. Thompson was charged with murder. No witnesses would testify. The charge did not proceed. That outcome, the crime, the charge, the silence, the acquittal, established something important about how Thompson operated and about the environment he operated in. People in Glasgow's criminal world understood that cooperating with investigations into Arthur Thompson carried consequences. That understanding was not theoretical. It had been demonstrated. His wife, Rita, was no passive figure in the background. In 1969, she forced her way into the Welsh family home and stabbed Patrick Welsh's widow in the chest. Rita Thompson was jailed for 3 years. The family absorbed the conviction and moved on. What the episode illustrated was that the Thompsons operated as a unit. The violence was not the work of one unstable individual. It was a family posture, a consistent message sent through whatever means the situation required. Rita's jailing barely registered as a setback. The criminal operation continued expanding. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Thompson's organization was significant enough to put him in contact with major criminal networks across Britain and, through them, with the emerging drug trade. Heroin began flooding into British cities during that period, in quantities and at a pace that transformed the criminal economy entirely. The profits were extraordinary, the supply chains crossed international borders, and the level of organization required to move product at volume suited Thompson's particular temperament. He did not get his hands dirty with street-level distribution. He never did. The structure of his operation was designed from the beginning to keep him insulated from the activity that generated the money. Others sold, others ran, others faced the risk of being caught in possession. Thompson sat above that layer, taking his share, making his decisions, and remaining largely untouched by the consequences that fell on the people below him. His home in Proven Mill, in the northeast of Glasgow, became known as the Ponderosa, a name taken from the ranch in the television western Bonanza. The comparison was deliberate and pointed. 2 adjacent council houses had been knocked into one, heavily secured, extended, transformed into something that announced Thompson's wealth and his permanence in the same breath. He owned legitimate businesses alongside his criminal operations, security companies and other ventures that provided cover for money and a degree of public respectability. By the early 1990s, estimates placed his weekly income from loan sharking alone at around £100,000. That figure, even accounting for exaggeration, gives a sense of the scale of what he had built over 4 decades. His son, Arthur Thompson Jr., known in Glasgow as Fat Boy, took charge of the drugs side of the family business during the 1980s. Jr. was a different creature from his father. He was conspicuous, cocaine-addicted, prone to the kind of visible excess that his father had always avoided. Where the elder Thompson built his power quietly and maintained it through fear and calculation, Jr. spent, dressed loudly, and behaved with the recklessness that addicts tend toward. He needed enforcers to ensure that drug debts were collected, and a young man from the neighboring Black Hill estate came into that role. Paul Ferris was 19 when he was brought into the Thompson organization. He was efficient, feared, and over the following years he rose into a position of some significance. That relationship, and the way it eventually fractured, would define one of the most dramatic episodes in Glasgow criminal history. The fracture came through the intervention of another Glasgow operator, Tam McGraw. McGraw had his own ambitions, his own connections to police intelligence, and his own interest in undercutting the Thompsons' dominance. During the mid-1980s, when Glasgow's heroin market was generating enormous profits, McGraw fed information that led to Arthur Jr. being charged with dealing. Jr. was convicted. He received a sentence of 10 years. The elder Thompson is reported to have visited McGraw afterward with a proposition: take the blame for the drugs, accept the sentence, and receive £20,000 in cash. McGraw declined. Jr. served his time. When he was eventually released, he returned to Glasgow carrying the resentment of a man who believed the system had failed him and that someone in it owed him a reckoning. On the 17th of August, 1991, Arthur Thompson Jr. was shot 3 times as he walked between the 2 houses that made up the Ponderosa. The shooter was never identified with certainty. A figure later referred to in court proceedings only as the apprentice has been named in some accounts, though no prosecution ever followed. Paul Ferris was arrested and charged with the murder. The trial that followed ran for 54 days, which at the time made it the longest criminal trial in Scottish history. Arthur Thompson Sr. appeared in court as a prosecution witness, giving evidence against his former employee. Observers at the time noted the significance of that. Thompson had built his entire career on the principle that people did not talk to police about crimes connected to him. He broke that rule himself at the one moment when he judged the stakes high enough. Ferris was acquitted by the jury. The elder Thompson, by several accounts, was devastated. On the morning of Arthur Jr.'s funeral, 2 men were found dead in a car in the East End of Glasgow. Joe Hanlon and Bobby Glover, both associates of Ferris, had been shot and left in the vehicle as a clear message, timed with deliberate precision to coincide with the moment the family was burying their son. Who ordered those killings has never been established in a court of law. The funerals, the acquittal, the dead men in the car, the whole sequence occurred within days and left Glasgow's criminal world recalibrated around a new set of balances. Thompson had spent 4 decades constructing a structure solid enough to withstand almost anything. He had survived a bombing. He had survived a shooting. He had absorbed the loss of associates and rivals alike. The murder of his son and the public acquittal of the man charged with that murder were damages of a different kind. They could not be repaired the way others had been, through force or demonstration or strategic silence. Arthur Thompson Sr. died on the 13th of March 1993. He was 61 years old. The cause was a heart attack. He died at his home in Glasgow, in the fortified compound he had built for himself over a lifetime of work in the city's criminal economy. He left behind a city in which the organised crime landscape was already beginning to shift toward the structures that would define it for the next 30 years. The drug trade had grown larger than any single family could contain. The hierarchies he had maintained through personal reputation were giving way to something more fragmented, more violent, and more difficult to manage. The men who came after him, in the Daniel and Lyons families, in the Gillespie network, in the operations that would eventually stretch from Baileyston to Brazil, were operating in a market he had helped to build, but one that no longer needed a single godfather at its centre. He had run Glasgow for 30 years. The city that came after him ran on a different model entirely. The legacy of Arthur Thompson is not easy to assess without acknowledging what it consisted of. He built an organization that extracted money from working-class people through fear, that distributed heroin into communities that were already struggling under deindustrialization, and that maintained its position through a willingness to kill that was demonstrated often enough to rarely need demonstrating again. He was never convicted of murder. He was never convicted of drug trafficking. He accumulated an estimated fortune of several million pounds through activity that left quantifiable damage behind it in the form of addiction, debt, and violence. He moved through the Scottish legal system for 30 years without collecting the convictions that his activities warranted. That fact, perhaps more than any other, is what made him the model that others in Glasgow's underworld studied and tried in their various ways to replicate. The difference between Thompson and almost everyone who followed him is that none of them managed it with quite the same sustained impunity. He set a standard that the city's criminals spent the next 3 decades failing to meet. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Arthur Thompson ran Glasgow's criminal economy for 30 years without a single conviction for the crimes that defined him. Next, we go to the wars that erupted in the years after his grip began to loosen, fought not with bombs or loan books, but with ice cream vans, heroin, and a house fire that killed 6 members of the same family and produced one of the most shameful miscarriages of justice in Scottish legal history. Section 2. Tam McGraw and the Ice Cream Wars. Heroin arrived in Glasgow's housing schemes during the early 1980s in much the way all genuinely destructive things arrive, quietly, incrementally, and through channels that already existed. The channel, in this case, was the ice cream van. In the sprawling East End estates, where unemployment had gutted whole streets after the shipyards and the factories closed, the vans operated as mobile shops, moving through schemes that often had no corner stores nearby. They were trusted, familiar, part of the daily rhythm. They were also, by the early 1980s, being used to sell more than ice cream cones and cigarettes. Stolen goods moved through some of them. Drugs moved through others. The routes themselves, the specific streets a driver covered each day, were worth money. And once something is worth money in a place where there is not much of it, people begin to fight over it. The fighting started as territory disputes between drivers. Windscreens were smashed. Tires were slashed. Drivers were threatened, beaten, run off their routes by rivals who wanted the income those routes generated. The violence escalated in the way these things tend to, each response slightly more severe than the one before it, until the gangs behind the vans were using the disputes as a proxy for something much larger, control of the drug supply running through the entire network. A driver who refused to carry was a driver who was in the way. A route that would not bend to the dominant gang was a route that needed to be taken by force. Into this environment came Andrew Doyle, 19 years old, working his van through the Rukazi scheme in Glasgow's East End. Doyle was not affiliated with any of the criminal interests trying to control his route. He drove his van, served his customers, and reportedly refused to use it as a vehicle for drug distribution. That refusal made him a problem for the people who were running the scheme's supply, and problems of that kind, in Glasgow in 1984, were dealt with through escalating pressure until they stopped being problems. The pressure applied to Doyle began with the standard methods: threats, property damage, intimidation. When those failed to move him, something much worse was arranged. At 2 in the morning on the 16th of April 1984, petrol was poured across the landing outside the top-floor flat on Bankend Street in Ruchazi, where Doyle lived with his family. It was set alight. The intention by some accounts was to frighten rather than kill, a final act of intimidation designed to break what threats had failed to break. What the people who set the fire did not know, or did not care about, was that the flat was full. Andrew Doyle was inside. So were his father, James, aged 53, his brothers James, 23, and Tony, 14, his sister Christine Halloran, 25, Christine's 18-month-old son Mark, and several others staying in the flat that night. The fire moved faster than any of them could escape it. 6 people died: James Doyle Sr., Christine Halloran, infant Mark, and the 3 brothers, James, Andrew, and Tony. 3 others survived. The youngest victim of the fire was a year and a half old. The public response was immediate and furious. Strathclyde police, under enormous pressure to make arrests and produce convictions, moved quickly. The case that emerged from their investigation centered on the testimony of one man, William Love, who told detectives he had heard 2 local men planning to put a fire to the Doyle flat as retribution for Doyle's failure to cooperate with their operations. The two men Love named were Thomas Campbell, 22, known as TC, and Joe Steele, 18. Both were brought to trial in 1984. Both were convicted. Campbell received a life sentence with a recommendation he serve no fewer than 20 years, alongside a separate 10-year term for a shotgun attack on Doyle's van earlier in the dispute. Steele received a life sentence with the same 20-year minimum. The jury returned unanimous verdicts on both men. The case appeared closed. It was not closed. Over the following 2 decades, T.C. Campbell and Joe Steele fought one of the most sustained and costly legal battles Scotland has ever seen. Both men maintained from the start that they had not set the Doyle fire, that they had not ordered it set, and that the conviction rested entirely on the word of a man who had reasons of his own to deflect police attention. In 1992, William Love recanted. He stated that his original testimony had been invented, a story constructed to obtain leniency for his own legal difficulties. The recantation should have been the end of the case. It was not. Appeals failed. The Scottish legal system absorbed the recantation and declined to overturn the convictions, finding reasons each time to conclude that the original verdicts could stand. Campbell went on hunger strike in protest. Steele, more theatrical in his methods, escaped from prison 3 times. On one occasion, in 1993, he superglued himself to the outer gates of Buckingham Palace in London to draw attention to what he called the injustice of his imprisonment. He told a journalist at the time that if he had actually killed the Doyle family, he would have admitted it and served his time quietly, because admitting guilt was the only path to parole. He could not admit guilt for something he said he had not done. The case was formally reopened in 2001. On the 16th of March 2004, 20 years after the convictions, Scotland's senior judge Lord Gill overturned both verdicts and declared that Campbell and Steele had been the victims of a miscarriage of justice. The evidence on which they had been convicted was found to be insufficient to sustain the original outcomes. Campbell emerged from court and told reporters that there was no jubilation in what had happened, only loss. The Doyle family had lost a family. He and Steele had lost 20 years. Campbell died in 2019 at the age of 66, of natural causes, at his home in Argyll. Joe Steele received £750,000 in compensation for the wrongful conviction. The Doyle fire has never been cleared. No one has ever been convicted of setting it. In 2010, a man named Gary Moore confessed to starting the blaze. He died 1 month after making that confession, and his statement resolved nothing legally. Joe Steele has said he does not believe Moore was responsible. He has said publicly that he believes the man who ordered the attack was Tam McGraw. Thomas McGraw was born on the 19th of February 1952 and grew up in the East End of Glasgow as a product of precisely the environment the housing schemes created: limited options, peer networks built around petty crime, and a progression through approved schools and borstalls that functioned, as they always do in those circumstances, more as criminal apprenticeships than deterrents. By his late teens, he was involved in the Barlanark team, a crew based around the Barlanark area of Glasgow that specialised in armed robbery. Post office raids across Scotland, cash in transit, targets selected for their vulnerability and their distance from the places the gang operated from. McGraw participated in those raids, was eventually caught in a failed attempt, and accumulated the early convictions that marked the start of his official record. What is striking about those years is less what was on the record than what was developing off it. Somewhere in the late 1970s and into the 1980s, McGraw began cultivating relationships with police that went considerably beyond the ordinary. He was reportedly in regular contact with 2 particular officers, referred to in Glasgow criminal circles by the nicknames Laurel and Hardy. The nature of those relationships has never been definitively established in public proceedings, but their practical effect is not in serious dispute. McGraw was known in the criminal world by the mid-1980s as the licensee. The name carried a specific meaning. He was said to have a license to commit crime, to operate under a degree of protection that explained why, in a period when almost everyone around him was accumulating serious convictions, McGraw himself was not. He watched colleagues go to prison. He watched Arthur Thompson's network contract under legal pressure. He watched the city's drug economy generate wealth that dwarfed anything the old-style robbery operations had produced, and he positioned himself to take a share of it. He and his wife Margaret, known as Mags, ran the Caravel pub in Barlanark. The pub became a focal point for criminal activity and for the violence that surrounds contested territory in Glasgow's East End. On one occasion, a fragmentation grenade containing approximately 1,700 ball bearings, was thrown into the pub. The device bounced off a door frame and rolled under a table. Everyone in the pub understood what it was and what it would do when it detonated. The barman, Joe Hanlon, picked it up and ran across the road, throwing it away from the building. It landed in a school playground before being moved to a nearby cemetery. Hanlon survived. He was later murdered, shot dead in the car in the East End of Glasgow on the morning of Arthur Jr.'s funeral in 1991. The grenade attack on the caravel tells the full story of the environment McGraw inhabited without needing much further explanation. This was the ecology in which he thrived. By the mid-1980s, McGraw's drug trafficking operation was generating money at a scale that the Barlanark team's post office raids could never have approached. His network moved heroin through Glasgow's schemes, with a reach and efficiency that reflected years of planning and relationship building. His drug trafficking activities have been estimated at a total value of approximately £14 million across the peak years of his operation. Simultaneously, he was building a legitimate business portfolio: security companies, taxi firms, properties across Scotland and into Ireland. The legitimate businesses did what they always do in these arrangements. They provided cover, absorbed cash, explained income that had no other plausible source. By the mid-1990s, his total estimated worth stood at around £10 million. He moved through Glasgow, presenting himself as a businessman, an employer, a legitimate figure in the commercial life of the East End. The legal system pursued him. It rarely caught him. In 1998, McGraw was brought to trial in connection with a drug smuggling operation. The evidence was substantial. The expectation in both police and criminal circles was that the trial would end in conviction. He was acquitted. The acquittal deepened the reputation the nickname had already given him. There was no other credible explanation, in the minds of many who observed it, for how a man so visibly central to Glasgow's drug economy had accumulated so few convictions relative to the crimes attributed to him. The license theory was not a conspiracy narrative. It was the working assumption of people who understood the city and watched what happened in it. The question of his role in the Doyle fire was never resolved in any legal forum. The allegation, made by Joe Steele and others who had followed the case closely, was that the fire was connected to McGraw's interest in controlling drug distribution in the Rukazi area, and that Andrew Doyle's refusal to participate in that distribution was the direct cause of the violence directed at him. Whether the fire was planned as a killing or was a frightener that went wrong has also never been established. What is certain is that 6 people died, that 2 innocent men spent 20 years in prison for it, and that the people responsible were never brought to justice. McGraw's later years were marked by the kinds of violence that attend any contested criminal operation at the level he was working. Associates were killed. His brother Francis was murdered. Rivals made attempts on people close to him. The city's criminal landscape was shifting around him as the Lyons and Daniel families consolidated their operations in the north of Glasgow, and the Gillespie network began building the infrastructure that would eventually generate hundreds of millions of pounds. McGraw was still active into the 2000s, still trading on his reputation, still protected by whatever combination of personal intelligence and police connection had kept him out of prison for so long. He was not a young man's criminal by then. He was a product of an earlier era, trying to maintain relevance in a drug economy that had grown well beyond the reach of any one figure. On the 30th of July 2007, Thomas McGraw died of a heart attack at his home in Mount Vernon in the southeast of Glasgow. He was 55 years old. He had no major drug convictions. He had no murder convictions. He left behind a business portfolio, a criminal legend, and a series of unanswered questions that Glasgow's legal system never found the will or the means to resolve. The Doyle fire is still officially unsolved. The identity of the licensee's police contacts was never formally established. The full extent of his drug operation was never laid out in a courtroom. He died with the same impunity that had defined his operating life, and the people who knew him best tended to describe him with the same combination of fear, contempt, and reluctant admiration that the city's criminal world had always reserved for men who managed to take without paying. What the ice cream wars and the career of Tam McGraw produced, beyond the immediate violence and the miscarriage of justice, was a demonstration of how completely the drug economy had transformed Glasgow's criminal landscape by the mid-1980s. The vans themselves were already irrelevant by the time the trials had ground through the courts. The territory they represented, the right to supply a scheme, the right to determine what moved through it and at what price, had become the organizing principle of Glasgow's underworld. Everything that followed in the next 40 years, the Daniel and Lyons feud, the Gillespie network, the encrypted phones and the South American supply chains grew from the same root. The vans had been the visible surface of something much larger and much harder to shift. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Tam McGraw died with almost no convictions for the crimes that defined 30 years of his life. The man who worked closest to him in the Thompson years was not so fortunate. Next, we look at Paul Ferris, the enforcer from Blackhill who stood alone in the dock during the longest criminal trial in Scottish history, and who built his own criminal operation from the wreckage of that acquittal. Section 3. Paul Ferris. The enforcer violence leaves marks that do not always show. Paul Ferris carried his on his skin. From the age of 9, growing up in Blackhill in Glasgow's north, he was systematically targeted by members of the Welsh family, a local criminal clan whose hold on the neighbourhood rested on exactly the kind of sustained intimidation they applied to him. The bullying was not casual. It was prolonged, deliberate, and at one point, when Ferris was 12 years old, members of the Welsh group hung him from a tree and left him there. He has never spoken at length about that day. What is documented is the medical consequence. The stress of those years brought on a severe case of psoriasis, a skin condition he carried for the rest of his life. What is also documented is what came next, because the boy the Welsh brothers had hung from a tree did not stay frightened. He came back with knives. The revenge campaign against the Welsh family started in his early teens and continued across several years, a series of attacks that announced to anyone watching in Blackhill that something had shifted in the calculation of what this particular young man was willing to do. Glasgow's criminal world was watching, and the conclusions it drew from what it saw were accurate. Ferris was arrested at 17 for assault and robbery and sent to Llangwrigand Remand Centre. He was bailed after several weeks and, while awaiting trial, was in a car that was stopped during a police chase. The car contained a shotgun and a collection of knives. He ran. He was captured after several weeks and returned to custody. At trial for the assault and robbery charges, he received 3 months in Glenorchy Detention Centre. He then returned to court for the charges arising from the car chase and was sentenced to a further year in Glenorchy Young Offenders Institution. Several weeks after that sentence ended, he was arrested attempting to rob a jeweller's shop. He was sent back to Llangwrigand. What that sequence of events produced across roughly 4 years from his mid-teens to his early 20s was a young man with a developing criminal record, a demonstrated tolerance for violence that set him apart from most of his peers, and a specific reputation in the Blackhill area that had travelled as far as the 2 adjacent houses on Proven Mill Road, where Arthur Thompson Sr. lived. Thompson noticed. Thompson always noticed. The mechanism by which a man like Thompson built his operation was, at its simplest, the identification of useful people. Ferris was 19 when he was brought into the organisation, put to work as an enforcer, and given the function that enforcers serve in any criminal economy, ensuring that what is owed is collected and that the cost of refusing is clearly communicated through the body of the person who refuses. Ferris was, by all accounts, extremely effective at this. The methods documented in court proceedings and criminal intelligence from that period included stabbings, slashings, blindings, and kneecappings. These were not random acts. Each one was an instruction sent to a specific audience about the consequences of non-compliance. The instruction was received. His first major confrontation with the legal system in his enforcer capacity came when he was charged with 4 counts of attempted murder following a shooting that left 1 man wounded in the thigh. 3 of the victims failed to identify him at an identity parade. The 4th picked him out. At trial, the outcome was a not proven verdict, the Scottish legal mechanism that sits between guilty and not guilty, and that Walter Scott once described as a bastard verdict. It meant Ferris walked out of the courtroom. He walked directly back to work. The break with Thompson came through an episode at a holiday home on Rothesay, on the Isle of Bute. Ferris had been accumulating charges again, a pickaxe handle and knives found in his car during an arrest, and while awaiting trial for those offences, he became involved in a stabbing. He fled to Thompson's property on the island to wait out the heat. Within a single day of arriving, armed police appeared at the door. He was arrested and charged with attempted murder and, additionally, possession of heroin with intent to supply. Both of those more serious charges were eventually dropped or resulted in acquittals, but the weapons in the car produced an 18-month sentence. He served it in Barlinnie. The circumstances of that arrest, the speed with which police had located him at a property belonging to Thompson, the addition of the heroin charge that had no obvious basis in what had brought him to Bute in the first place, These details settled into a conviction in Ferris's mind that Thompson had provided the information that led to his door. That conviction, whether accurate or not, ended the working relationship between them and created something considerably more dangerous. A man with Ferris's capabilities who no longer considered himself bound by the loyalties that had previously constrained him. After his release, he set up a legitimate business, a double glazing and conservatory company called Cottage Conservatories, and operated it alongside continued activity in the criminal economy. This pattern, the legitimate front alongside the continuing criminal work, is familiar enough in Glasgow's underworld that it barely requires comment. What was changing in his circumstances was the nature of the hostility building around him. His break with Thompson had made him an enemy of the family whose patriarch still commanded most of the respect available in Glasgow's organised crime landscape. His growing feud with Tam McGraw, whose own criminal operation was expanding through exactly the period when Ferris was building his reputation, created a second dangerous front. In September 1991, Ferris was shot multiple times in a targeted attack. He survived. His alleged connection to that shooting, and the counter-violence it implied, formed part of the background noise of a period in Glasgow's underworld that was growing progressively louder. The event that brought all of it to a point was the murder of Arthur Thompson Jr. On the 17th of August 1991, Fatboy Thompson was shot 3 times as he walked between the 2 houses that made up the Ponderosa in Provenmill. He died at the scene. Paul Ferris was the immediate suspect. He was arrested and charged with murder, as well as with supplying drugs and possessing a firearm. The trial that followed, held at the High Court in Glasgow, ran for 54 days. At the time, it was the longest criminal trial in Scottish history. The case against Ferris was built from a collection of witness testimonies, forensic evidence, and the extraordinary spectacle of Arthur Thompson Sr. appearing in the witness box for the prosecution. The elder Thompson giving evidence in a murder trial was without precedent. A man who had spent 40 years ensuring that no one in Glasgow's criminal world would speak against him or his family, had chosen to break that rule himself, and he had done it in the one case where he believed the stakes were personal enough to justify it. Most observers at the time concluded that if Ferris was convicted, he would not survive his sentence. Thompson had the reach and the will to have him killed inside. The morning of Arthur Jr.'s funeral brought a development that shook even those in Glasgow's criminal world who thought they understood the territory. 2 men were found dead in a car in the east end of the city, Bobby Glover and Joe Hanlon, both associates of Ferris, both known to have been close to him during the events surrounding the murder charge. They had been shot. The timing was deliberate, calculated, aimed at a specific funeral morning in a specific part of the city. Who was responsible has never been established in any court. The killings were a message sent to Ferris while he was in custody awaiting trial, about what was coming if the verdict went against him. The verdict did not go against him. The jury acquitted Ferris of all charges. He walked out of the High Court in Glasgow in 1992, a free man, cleared of the murder that had consumed 2 years of his life and the longest criminal trial in Scottish history up to that point. Arthur Thompson Sr. died the following year, on the 13th of March 1993, of a heart attack. By several accounts, the acquittal had broken something in him. The son he had built his empire to pass on to was dead, and the man he held responsible had stood in the same courtroom as him and been cleared. The Ponderosa sat empty. The organisation Thompson had spent 30 years constructing began to disperse. Ferris did not disappear. He built, in the years following the acquittal, his own network of criminal connections that extended well beyond Glasgow. The arms trade interested him. The movement of weapons, like the movement of drugs, operated through supply chains that crossed jurisdictions and required relationships with people who existed at significant removes from any individual transaction. Ferris developed those relationships. In 1995, police and intelligence services began watching him. The surveillance operation that followed involved both MI5 and Special Branch, ran for 2 years, and targeted his activities in London as well as Scotland. The scope of that surveillance, the involvement of domestic intelligence services in what was ostensibly a criminal investigation, reflected the assessment that what Ferris was doing by the mid-1990s had moved beyond the scale of ordinary organised crime enforcement. He was arrested in London in 1997. The trial took place at the Old Bailey in July 1998. The charges were conspiracy to sell or transfer prohibited weapons, conspiracy to deal in firearms, and possessing explosives. He was convicted on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 10 years imprisonment. His legal team appealed, and in May 1999, the Court of Appeal in London reduced the sentence to 7 years. He served the majority of that term at Frankland Prison in County Durham, among the most secure facilities in the English prison estate. While inside, he co-authored his autobiography with the crime writer Reg Mackay. The book, titled The Ferris Conspiracy, sold 20,000 copies during the period of his imprisonment. The audience for it was large enough to confirm what Glasgow had always suspected, that the story of Paul Ferris was not merely local, not merely a footnote in the city's criminal history, but something the wider public recognized as genuinely significant. He was released from Frankland in January 2002. He stated publicly that he was leaving criminal life behind him. By May of that same year, he was back in custody, his parole conditions breached after an altercation involving Tam McGraw. The knife fight between them, and a reported connection to a large cannabis shipment that was later established to have been grossly exaggerated by newspaper coverage, ended the brief experiment with legitimate life. He returned to prison, served the additional time, and emerged into a city whose criminal landscape had changed substantially during the years his case had consumed. The career of Paul Ferris runs from Black Hill in the early 1980s to the Old Bailey in 1998, and covers 2 decades of violence, acquittals, convictions, and survival in circumstances that killed most of the people around him. Joe Hanlon was murdered. Bobby Glover was murdered. Arthur Thompson Jr. was murdered. Tam McGraw died of a heart attack. Arthur Thompson Sr. died of a heart attack. Ferris outlived them all. His record is not clean, and the crimes it reflects cause direct harm to real people in real places across Glasgow and beyond. But as a case study in how an individual accumulates and then loses and then partially rebuilds criminal standing in a city like Glasgow, across a period when that city's underworld was transforming from something resembling a feudal structure into something more like an international business, his story is among the most complete that Glasgow's courts have ever produced. He did not run Glasgow, but for a period in the late 1980s and early 1990s, almost no serious conversation about who ran it could proceed without accounting for him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Paul Ferris was acquitted of murder and eventually convicted of arms dealing, a trajectory that took him from the Ponderosa in Proven Mill to the Old Bailey in London and back again. Next, we leave the East End behind and move to Mary Hill, where a crime boss named Frank McPhee built a different kind of operation and met a different kind of ending. A single rifle shot from 8 floors up, fired by a sniper who was never identified. Section 4. Frank McPhee. The Mary Hill boss armed robbery was the defining criminal economy of a specific Glasgow generation. Men who came of age in the 1960s and 1970s, before the drug trade had established itself as the dominant source of criminal income, and who built their reputations through the kind of work that required nerve, speed, and a willingness to point a weapon at another person and mean it. The rewards were real but finite, the sentences were predictable and severe, and the men who stayed in it long enough accumulated records that told their own story, a steady alternation between liberty and imprisonment, each cycle producing slightly different men on the other side of it. Frank McPhee came out of that world and then, like most of the criminals of his generation who were paying attention, he moved into drugs. The transition made him wealthier and more dangerous, and considerably harder to bring to court. It also, in the end, made him a target of a different kind than armed robbery had ever made him. He was born on the 21st of October 1948 in Lennoxtown in Stirlingshire, north of Glasgow, and his family had roots that placed him at the intersection of 2 communities Glasgow knew well, the settled working class and the Irish traveller tradition his mother came from. She had adopted a settled life before her children were born, but the traveller inheritance was not entirely dissolved. McPhee and his 5 sisters grew up knowing the shelter language, the cant spoken in Irish traveller communities, though accounts suggest McPhee found it embarrassing when his mother used it in front of his friends, the ordinary self-consciousness of a child caught between 2 worlds. The family moved briefly to Edinburgh before settling in Mary Hill in the northwest of Glasgow, and Mary Hill is where McPhee spent the rest of his life. The district then, as now, was working class, dense with tenement housing, close enough to the city centre to feel urban, but carrying the distinct social identity of a neighbourhood that had been shaped by its own history of industry and economic difficulty. He knew it with the intimate knowledge that comes from spending a lifetime in one place, and he used that knowledge the way territorial criminals always do. His criminal record began with robbery, and stayed there for the better part of 2 decades. He was jailed in 1978 for 5 years for robbery. He was jailed again in 1986 for 5 years for an armed raid. 2 convictions separated by 8 years, each producing a sentence of similar length, each followed by a return to the same city and the same basic activity. In 1990, he appeared in court in connection with a £42,000 armed raid and was cleared. That acquittal was not, in the context of his record, surprising. Glasgow's criminal economy had always operated in an environment where witnesses exercised careful judgment about what they were willing to say in public, and McPhee's reputation in Maryhill was substantial enough to make that judgment easy for most people who might otherwise have considered cooperating with any investigation into his activities. Being cleared did not mean being innocent. It meant being the kind of person that witnesses calculated was too dangerous to speak against. The move into drugs was made clear by the conviction that followed. In 1992, McPhee was sentenced to 8 years for his involvement in a drug deal worth £200,000. The scale of that deal, even discounting for whatever margin the market applied, placed him firmly in the category of dealer who moves at volume, sourcing product and distributing it, rather than selling at street level. This is a structural point worth understanding. The people who get caught in possession at street level are the lowest layer of any drug supply chain. The people who get convicted for deals measured in hundreds of thousands of pounds are operating several layers above that, at the point where the economics of the trade become genuinely significant. McPhee's 1992 conviction established that he was operating at that level, which also meant he had the connections, the infrastructure, and the financial capacity that comes with it. He served the sentence and returned to Maryhill. What came next, across the period between his release and his death in 2000, illustrated in concentrated form the difficulty Scottish courts faced in the 1990s when trying to build cases against men of McPhee's standing. In 1997, he was prosecuted for the killing of William Toy, known as Worm, who had been stabbed to death in Perth prison while McPhee was serving time there. The case went to trial. The verdict was not proven. Not proven, in Scottish law, is neither a conviction nor the formal declaration of innocence that a not guilty verdict provides. It is a third path, one available only in Scotland, which acknowledges that the jury was not satisfied beyond reasonable doubt while declining to state that the accused did not commit the act. It does not prevent another prosecution on different evidence. It leaves open, in the public record, a space between established guilt and established innocence that the person carrying it must navigate for the rest of their life. McPhee collected it for the Perth prison killing and moved on. In 1998, 3 months after his release from the sentence he had been serving when the Toy killing occurred, he was back in court. This time the charge was the murder by strangulation of a man named Chris McGrory. The circumstances of McGrory's death and the events that led to McPhee being charged were not laid out publicly in any detail that subsequent reporting has preserved in full. The outcome, however, was the same, not proven. 2 separate murder trials in successive years, both ending in not proven verdicts. The combined effect of those outcomes on his standing in Maryhill and in Glasgow's wider criminal world is not difficult to assess. Men who stand in the dock twice for murder and walk out twice, without a conviction, acquire a particular kind of reputation. The specific charges and the specific outcomes communicate something to the people watching from both sides of the law. To his criminal associates, the verdicts confirmed what his entire career had suggested, that he was the kind of man courts found very difficult to convict. To law enforcement, the same verdicts produced a different kind of frustration. By the spring of 2000, McPhee was operating in a criminal environment that had grown considerably more complex than the one he had entered as a young man in the 1970s. The drug trade that had produced his 1992 conviction had expanded dramatically during the intervening decade. New players had arrived with new supply chains. The north of Glasgow was contested territory between families whose ambitions did not always align with those of an established Maryhill operator trying to maintain or extend his market position. Sources connected to the investigation into his death later suggested that he had been attempting to move into territory or supply lines that other, more powerful criminal interests considered their own. One theory pursued by detectives was that he had tried to muscle in on drug trade that was being controlled, at least in part, by individuals with connections to former Irish paramilitary organisations, whose involvement in drug trafficking across Britain had become a significant element of the criminal economy by the late 1990s. Whether that theory was accurate and whether it was connected to what happened on the evening of the 10th of May 2000 was never established in any court. On that evening, McPhee left his flat in Guthrie Street in Maryhill and drove a white Ford Transit van, registration Q294TDS, out of the area and south to Bothwell in Lanarkshire. The journey was unusual enough that police, investigating afterward, treated it as significant. He was not making a routine trip. What he did in Bothwell, who he met or attempted to meet, and what the purpose of the journey was, remain unknown. What is known is that the journey back was not calm. On the return along the M8 motorway and then the M74, McPhee drove at speed in what witnesses and investigators described as an attempt to lose a pursuing vehicle. Whether he lost it, or whether the vehicle following him simply fell back because it had already accomplished what it needed to accomplish, is not established. He arrived back in Maryhill and parked the transit van on Kelvindale Road, some distance from his flat. He then walked approximately 20 yards back toward his home on Guthrie Street. It was around 9 in the evening. The street was not empty. The shot came from the 8th floor of a nearby block of flats. A sniper had positioned themselves at a point that provided a clear line of sight to the route McPhee would walk from wherever he parked to his front door. The weapon was a .22 caliber rifle, fitted with a telescopic sight. A single round was fired. It struck McPhee in the head. He died at the scene. His son was present and witnessed what happened. The building from which the shot was fired was the kind of place, a residential tower block, where people moved in and out without necessarily attracting attention, and where an individual carrying a long weapon could, with care, enter a stairwell and reach an upper floor without being reliably observed by anyone who would later speak to police about it. The sniper left the scene. Police subsequently established that a £5,000 contract had been placed on McPhee's life, though the identity of whoever placed that contract and whoever accepted it was never publicly confirmed through any prosecution. Guthrie Street is approximately 500 yards from Maryhill Police Station. The distance is not coincidental in what it communicates. An execution carried out within 500 yards of a police station, in the evening on a residential street in northwest Glasgow, required either a calculation that the location carried no particular risk, or a decision that whatever risk it carried was acceptable. The sniper was never identified. No one was ever charged with McPhee's murder. The case remains open and officially unsolved, part of a category of Glasgow killings from that period that the criminal world understood and the legal system could not close. Detectives pursuing the investigation considered and publicly noted several theories beyond the Irish paramilitary connection. One involved the long-running competition between two Glasgow criminal families for territorial dominance, in which McPhee's activities may have constituted a complication or a threat. Another concerned his reported role as a negotiator between drug suppliers operating in different parts of Britain, brokering arrangements between dealers in northern England and those in Scotland. That kind of intermediary position is both valuable and dangerous. Valuable because both sides of any arrangement require someone with the trust and the knowledge to hold the transaction together. Dangerous because an intermediary who becomes inconvenient, or who knows too much about the operations of powerful people on both sides of a deal, is the precise kind of person who ends up at the center of a calculation about whether allowing them to continue is worth the risk. McPhee's negotiating role, if the descriptions of it that reached investigators were accurate, placed him in that position. Someone made the calculation. There was also, separately, a police investigation into alleged connections between McPhee and a scheme to establish what was described as a network for dogfighting operations across Scotland. The detail, which appeared in reporting around the time of his death, was unusual enough in context that it sat slightly apart from the drug trade and territorial violence stories that otherwise defined his career. Glasgow's criminal economy in the 1990s encompassed a considerable range of activity beyond narcotics, and the specific combination of gambling culture, animal cruelty, and organized crime that dogfighting represents had enough historical resonance in parts of urban Scotland to make it a plausible element of his wider interests. Whether that investigation contributed in any way to the circumstances of his death is not established. What is established is the shape of his career as a whole: 2 decades of armed robbery, producing 2 5-year sentences, a move into the drug trade at a meaningful level, producing an 8-year sentence, 2 murder charges, both producing not proven verdicts. And then, in the spring of 2000, a single shot fired from a rooftop while his son watched. The progression is not unusual in its broad outline. The men who spent long careers in Glasgow's criminal economy and who reached the level of operation McPhee had reached by the late 1990s tended to attract exactly the kind of lethal attention that ended him. What made his case distinctive was the precision of it. This was not a drive-by shooting, not a confrontation that went wrong, not a weapon produced in a moment of escalation. A rifle was carried to an 8th-floor position, a scope was used, a single shot was fired. The target was identified, tracked, and killed, with the deliberateness of someone who was absolutely certain about what they were doing and who had thought carefully about how to do it. The question of who commissioned that precision and who delivered it belongs to the category of Glasgow criminal history that the city keeps to itself. The people who knew were not the people who talked, and the people who might have been persuaded to talk were subject to the same calculation that had always governed witness behavior in cases touching on McPhee and men of his standing. The investigation into his murder produced no charges. No one sat in a dock for it. No judge issued a sentence. Guthrie Street absorbed the event and moved on, as streets do, and McPhee joined the list of Glaswegians whose violent deaths the legal system recorded without ever resolving. He was 51 years old when he was killed, a man who had survived more than 30 years of professional criminality in one of Britain's most violent cities, who had stood in the dock for murder twice and walked away twice, and who was brought down in the end not by a court or a competitor facing him directly, but by someone he likely never saw, positioned above and at a distance, waiting. The distance was the point. The calculation that produced the shot was the same calculation that has always separated the most dangerous commissions in Glasgow's underworld from the ordinary violence that surrounds them. Proximity is exposure, distance is safety. Whoever was on the 8th floor of that Mary Hill Tower block understood both things completely. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Frank McPhee was shot dead by a sniper who was never found, leaving a murder that Glasgow's courts never resolved. The next section moves further into the north of the city, where a different kind of criminal operation was being assembled, not through armed robbery or individual reputation, but through family structure, territorial control, and a feud over a stolen drug stash that would generate more violence over the following 2 decades than almost anything else in Glasgow's modern criminal history. Section 5. Jamie Daniel, the scrap metal king. Scrap metal was the legitimate vocabulary. It gave you a reason to move between locations, to handle cash, to know people across the north of Glasgow who had things they needed to shift quietly. Jamie Daniel grew up in Postle Park, one of 10 children, his father dead by the time he was 10 years old, and he followed his brothers into the family scrap metal business before he followed the money somewhere considerably more serious. The progression from one to the other was not dramatic. It was the kind of accumulation that happens when a person with genuine commercial instincts operates in an environment where the legitimate economy has been largely withdrawn and where the illegal one has taken its place with sufficient structure and volume to support genuine ambition. He started with shoplifting and loan sharking, moved to stealing car wheels and scrap metal, and at some point began melting down stolen aluminium beer barrels for profit. None of that was going to make him wealthy. Heroin was going to make him wealthy. He spotted that early, and he moved. In 1983, Daniel was 25 years old and already operating in the drug trade at a level that had attracted attention beyond Scotland. He was convicted in England of heroin smuggling and sentenced to 4 years in prison. The conviction is notable for 2 reasons. First, the fact that it happened in England indicated the reach of his supply operations. He was not simply distributing within Glasgow, but was involved in movements across the border at a point when his organisation was still in its early stages. Second, and more significantly, he came out of that 4-year sentence and continued. He did not recalibrate toward caution, he expanded. Stolen cars, firearms, drug smuggling, across a network that now incorporated contacts in London, Manchester, and Liverpool, all built on a foundation that had been laid before he had reached his 30s. He forged connections with a Scottish-Pakistani family capable of importing high-purity heroin in substantial volumes, a partnership that gave him access to product quality and supply consistency that independent operators working through fewer connections could not match. That kind of supply arrangement is what separates a significant criminal operation from a local one. It is not about the willingness to sell, it is about being able to guarantee product at volume, reliably, which requires relationships that stretch well beyond any single city. By the time the Sunday Mail identified him publicly in 2003 as Scotland's richest underworld figure, placing him ahead of Tam McGraw on a list that was itself a kind of criminal inventory of the country, his annual empire was estimated at £16 million. The figure is striking partly because of its scale, and partly because it represents an operation that had been running for roughly 2 decades with only one significant conviction attached to it. That ratio, the proportion of activity to legal consequence, is the measure of a genuinely sophisticated criminal enterprise. It does not happen by accident. It requires careful management of exposure, the insulation of the principal from the transactions that generate the money, and the kind of loyalty structures within an organization that ensure that when people are arrested, they do not become the starting point for a chain of evidence leading upward. Daniel maintained those structures across a period that covered the most intensive law enforcement focus Scotland had ever directed at organised crime. The Sunday Mail naming him was notable, not because it revealed something unknown to police, but because it made public what investigators had been building a picture of for years without being able to close it off in a courtroom. His reputation for retribution was precise and well documented in the criminal world, even if rarely in the courts. 2 doormen who attacked a member of the Daniel family at a Glasgow nightclub found their cars blown up shortly afterward. The message encoded in that response is one that any criminal operation requires its environment to understand. There is a cost attached to crossing the family, and that cost will be delivered. The specific choice of cars rather than bodies tells its own story about calibration. Cars can be replaced. The experience of waking up to find a vehicle destroyed communicates something permanent about capability and intention, without creating the kind of legal exposure that a murder investigation generates. It was a calculated response, not a disproportionate one, and that calculation was itself the point. The connection alleged between Daniel and the death of Frank McPhee in May 2000 has never been established in any legal proceeding and remains unproven. What reporting from that period established was that McPhee had allegedly assaulted a member of the Daniel family in the weeks before his death, and that the subsequent sniper killing bore the hallmarks of an arranged commission rather than a spontaneous attack. The proximity in time between the reported assault and the killing, and the level of organization that the sniper shooting implied, led investigators and journalists to conclude that the 2 events were connected. Daniel was linked to the killing in the public record. He was never charged. The murder remains officially unsolved. The structure of the empire he built rested on geographic concentration and family loyalty in roughly equal measure. The Daniels were a Postle Park family, rooted in the north of Glasgow across multiple generations, and that rootedness provided the social infrastructure that criminal organizations in Glasgow have always depended on. Networks of obligation, shared history, and the knowledge of individual reliability that comes from growing up alongside people rather than recruiting them from strangers. The industrial estate on Stronend Street in Postle Park, which police would later describe as a stronghold of the Daniel clan, was the kind of physical anchor that long-running criminal operations tend to establish. A location with enough legitimate cover to explain activity, enough space to operate, and enough familiarity with the surrounding area that surveillance is complicated. The location is not incidental. It is part of the architecture. By 2003, the operation extended far enough geographically and commercially that cigarette smuggling had become a significant component of the revenue stream. Estimates from investigators at the time placed the income from that arm of the business at up to £1 million per month. Cigarette smuggling is attractive to large criminal organizations for structural reasons. The margins on contraband tobacco are substantial. The product is heavy and bulky rather than concentrated like drugs, which means it requires genuine logistics capacity to move, and the criminal penalties for it are considerably lighter than those attached to Class A drug offences. For an organisation with the infrastructure to handle volume and the connections to move product across jurisdictions, it slots naturally alongside the drug trade without replacing it. The 2 streams reinforced each other. The logistics capacity built for one served the other. The 2010 road rage incident near his home on Munro Road in Jordan Hill illuminated something about Daniel that his decades of careful insulation from prosecution had obscured. That below the commercial discipline and the careful management of exposure, there was a temper that was not always under control. A student driver near his house produced some kind of confrontation, after which Daniel chased the vehicle, attempted to grab the driver, and struck the car with a metal pole. The incident was not the act of a man calculating his exposure. It was the act of a man who expected the world around him to bend to his will, and reacted with disproportionate force when it did not. At Glasgow Sheriff Court, he admitted breach of the peace and 2 counts of assaulting a fellow prisoner while he was on remand in Barlinnie. He was jailed for 1 year and served 6 months. The sentence, measured against his decades of activity, was an almost comically small legal consequence for a man of his standing in Scotland's criminal hierarchy. It was also his last conviction. Daniel died on the 4th of July 2016. He had been battling cancer for 4 years. He told his doctors he wanted to die at home rather than in hospital, and he died in the £400,000 house in Jordan Hill where he had lived for years, having accumulated that address and that comfort from a life that had begun in Postle Park with a dead father and 10 siblings. He was 58. Around 600 people attended his funeral at Clydebank Crematorium. Elvis Presley's In the Ghetto played as his coffin was carried in. His son Xander, who at the time was serving a 13-and-a-half-year sentence for heroin dealing, was allowed out of prison under guard to help carry the coffin. A civil celebrant described the man in the box as a scrap metal dealer who had enjoyed bungee jumping, hunting, jet skiing, playing pool, and supporting rangers. He had 10 children and 10 grandchildren. No mention was made of his criminal past. The celebrant noted that he was someone who liked to be in control and was usually 2 steps ahead of everyone else. That observation, intended as an affectionate tribute, was also the most accurate description of his operational career that anyone offered publicly on the day of his funeral. The power vacuum his death created was the variable that destabilized the north of Glasgow in the months that followed. Criminal organizations, built around a single dominant figure, sustained by that figure's relationships and personal authority, do not transfer smoothly to successors. The Daniels had no obvious heir, in the sense that Arthur Thompson had groomed his son, imperfectly and unsuccessfully, to continue the organization. The family network continued, but the center of gravity shifted and wobbled. His nephew, Stephen Daniel, known as Bonzo, emerged as the most visible figure, attempting to hold the operation together. In May 2017, a high-speed chase through North Glasgow ended with Bonzo crashing his Skoda Octavia and losing consciousness behind the wheel. His car had been fitted with a tracking device. His attackers, who had followed him using that device, attacked him with bladed weapons as he sat immobile in the wreckage. His injuries were so severe that the first officers to arrive at the scene initially believed he had been shot rather than cut. His nose was described in court as nearly severed from his face. That attack, and the feud that produced it, had its origin in a single event in 2001, years before Jamie Daniels' death. 2 individuals connected to the rival Lyons family, based in the neighbouring Milton estate just north of Postle Park, stole a £20,000 stash of cocaine from a Daniel safe house. That theft, measured in purely financial terms, was almost trivial relative to the scale of what both organizations were generating. But the logic of organized crime does not price these incidents by their monetary value. The theft communicated something about territory, about respect, about the boundaries of what could be taken without consequence. The Daniels could not absorb that communication without responding to it. The Lyons could not ignore the response without absorbing one of their own. What began with £20,000 of cocaine became 25 years of shootings, murders, attempted murders, car chases, machete attacks, and convictions running into the hundreds of years of combined sentences. The entry cost of that feud was low. The accumulated price was extraordinary. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Jamie Daniel built a £16 million a year criminal empire from Postle Park and died in a £400,000 house in Jordan Hill with 600 people at his funeral. The feud his organisation was drawn into outlived him and produced some of the most public gangland violence Glasgow has ever seen. Next, the most notorious single act of that feud, an execution in a supermarket car park, 13 shots and 25 seconds. Section 6, Kevin Carroll. Gerbil Wednesday lunchtime at a supermarket, in the Roybroyston area of North Glasgow, is not a setting that carries obvious menace. It is precisely because of that ordinariness that it became the setting it became. At 23 minutes and 17 seconds past 1 on the 13th of January 2010, a Volkswagen Golf pulled into the Asda car park and stopped across the front of a black Audi A3. 2 men in masks got out. They were carrying firearms. The Audi's driver, a 25-year-old man named John Bonner, saw them coming, scrambled out of his side of the vehicle, fell to the ground, heard shots, and ran. In falling, He had the car keys in his hand. The locking mechanism engaged as he hit the ground. The Audi locked itself with the man in the back seat, still inside it. 25 seconds after the Golf arrived, it left. In the back of the Audi, Kevin Carroll was dead. 13 shots had been fired through the windscreen of the car. Carroll, 29 years old, had been struck in the head and in the chest. The ASDA duty manager, Stephen McKenna, watched the entire sequence from an upstairs office window. He stood motionless, then activated a panic alarm and called the emergency services as he made his way down to the car park. A shopper named Emma Busby came out of the front of the store in time to see one of the gunmen with a weapon she later described to the jury as resembling something from a Western film. She heard 8 to 10 shots and went back inside, walked to the pharmacy area and sat down, and was sick. In her evidence at the subsequent murder trial, she told the court she had thought for a moment that she was caught up in another Dunblane. The reference tells everything about what those 25 seconds looked like from outside. Francis Green, known as Fraggle, arrived at the car park shortly after the shooting. He was Carroll's friend, and his sister was Carroll's girlfriend. He went into the Audi twice. He told the court he went in to retrieve a ringing phone, to check whether it was his sister calling. Police officers who reviewed the footage of Green entering the locked car twice, while Carroll lay dead inside it, asked in court whether any first aid reason existed for the repeated entries. The answer given was no. Stephen Glenn, a drug dealer who had been standing nearby in the car park at the time of the shooting, called Green immediately afterward and told him his pal was dead. Glenn had seen it happen. He had come to the ASDA that afternoon to meet Carroll, summoned there by a phone call from Carroll the previous day. The meeting Carroll wanted was not social. Carroll had told Glenn the day before that he was working for the Daniel organization now, that anyone who did not fall in line was going to face consequences. Glenn had been terrified by the summons and had called his own associate, Alan Johnston, to ask for advice. Johnston had told him to change his phone number and stay away. Carroll never made the meeting he had arranged with Glenn. The gunman arrived first. Kevin Carroll had been a central figure in the Daniel criminal network for years before the Rob Royston shooting. His connection to the organization ran deeper than employment. He was Jamie Daniels' son-in-law, married into the family at the top of the operation, which gave him a standing within it that went beyond the kind of loyalty that hired associates might command. He was also, by numerous accounts across the period he was active, one of the most feared individuals operating in North Glasgow's drug trade. Stories from the period describe him breaking the fingers of dealers who had stepped out of line, and on at least one occasion threatening a dealer with a grinder, telling him he would cut his nipples off. These are not peripheral details of character. They are descriptions of the enforcement function he performed for the organization, the mechanism by which debts were collected and discipline was maintained. That function requires the person performing it to be genuinely dangerous, in ways that the people subject to that danger can clearly perceive. Carroll performed it effectively enough that his reputation circulated independently of any specific incident. His rivalry with the Lyons family had its roots further back than the 2001 cocaine theft that formally ignited the feud. Reports from that period placed it as far back as his school days, when Carroll was said to have been bullied by members of the Lyons family in the North Glasgow area where both families lived. Whether that account is accurate in its detail, the animosity was real and sustained, and Carroll was one of its most active expressions on the Daniel side. He had survived 2 previous attempts on his life before the Rob Royston shooting. In 2003 he was shot. In 2006 he was shot again. Both attacks were connected to the ongoing conflict between the 2 families. In 2004 he had been charged with attempting to murder a gang member using an AK-47 assault rifle. That trial collapsed, he continued. His police intelligence file, in the period before his death, described him in terms that reflected both the specificity of his criminal activity and the difficulty law enforcement had in building prosecutable cases against him. He was described as a major player in the drugs trade and in all manner of associated criminality. Major enough, by January 2010, that the Lyons organization had committed to ending him with 2 gunmen and a Golf in a supermarket car park at lunchtime. The guns used in the killing were recovered 13 days after the shooting. 2 council gardeners clearing a patch of ground at the back of Coatbridge Library in North Lanarkshire found a black self-loading pistol and a revolver that one of the gardeners later described in court as a cowboy-style weapon in a shopping bag in the undergrowth on the 26th of January 2010. The guns were examined forensically. DNA recovered from the pistol matched a man named Ross Monaghan. The chance of the DNA belonging to anyone else calculated at 1 in a billion. Monaghan, 30 years old, was arrested at his home in Penally at 4 in the morning. Armed response officers attended along with detectives. His partner was at the home. An ambulance called because of her ongoing health problems. Monaghan was charged with the murder. The trial of Ross Monaghan was held at the High Court in Glasgow. He denied the charge and entered a special defence of alibi, claiming he had been at an address in Cumbernauld at the time of the shooting. The jury returned a not proven verdict. Monaghan walked free. The DNA evidence, despite its statistical weight, had not been sufficient to overcome the alibi and the other elements of the defence case. The acquittal left the killing formally unresolved, which in the logic of the feud meant it remained a debt outstanding between the two families. A second man was subsequently identified as a suspect. William Patterson, who had been arrested in Madrid and returned to Scotland under extradition proceedings, was charged with Carroll's murder and stood trial at the High Court in Glasgow. He was 35 at the time of his trial, which ran for 2 weeks. He denied the charge and offered a defence of alibi, claiming he had been at an address in Cumbernauld on the day, and additionally named 6 other people as the responsible parties. The jury convicted him. Judge Lord Armstrong, sentencing Patterson to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 22 years, told him that on the evidence the court had heard, the murder appeared to have been premeditated and planned, carried out in the most calculated way. He described the killing of Carroll as having been done in the most vicious and brutal manner possible, and said it had not been a spontaneous event. It was, in the judge's precise words, in effect an execution. That description, execution, is accurate in its clinical sense and illuminating in what it implies about the structure of violence in the feud. An execution is not a fight that goes wrong. It is not a confrontation in which a weapon is produced in anger. It is a decision made in advance, a plan constructed and executed, with the specific intention of killing a specific person at a specific time and place, in a way that maximizes the certainty of the outcome. The VW Golf in the Robroyston Asda car park represented weeks or months of planning, identifying Carroll's movements, selecting the location, obtaining and preparing the weapons, coordinating the timing, establishing the getaway route, and disposing of the firearms afterward, in a location far enough from the scene to reduce the connection, but close enough in time to still carry recoverable evidence. All of that was done. Carroll was dead within 25 seconds of the Golf arriving. What made the Robroyston killing different from most of the violence that had preceded it in the Daniel Lyons feud was its setting. Glasgow's gangland shootings of that era occurred in flats, in cars, on quiet streets at night, in garages, in environments that were either empty enough of witnesses or dark enough to obscure them. The Asda car park at Robroyston at 1:30 in the afternoon was none of those things. Lunchtime shoppers, mothers with children, a supermarket manager watching from an upstairs window, a care home chef who thought she was watching a massacre. The choice to commit the killing there and then either reflected a miscalculation about the civilian presence, which is possible, or a decision that the civilian presence was not a sufficient deterrent given the operational logic of the situation, which is a different and more disturbing conclusion. It was, as sources close to the investigation described it afterward, arguably the most public gangland hit ever carried out in Scotland. The aftermath within the feud was predictable in structure, if not in detail. Carroll's death was not absorbed by the Daniels as a settled outcome. The conviction of William Patterson, which did not come until 2015, 5 years after the killing, did not resolve the underlying tension. The Lyons organisation had killed Jamie Daniels' son-in-law in a supermarket car park. The acquittal of Ross Monaghan, and the 5-year gap between the killing and the only conviction it produced, left a space in the accounting that the logic of the feud required to be filled. Carroll's death became one of the fixed reference points around which subsequent violence organised itself. Members and associates of both families operated under threat-to-life warnings in the years that followed. Shootings occurred. Slashings occurred. Robert Daniel, a cousin, was shot in the arm outside his home in Steps. Another Robert Daniel, a different relative, was attacked with machetes at the Dorsholm Recycling Centre in Maryhill in September 2021. His injuries so severe during the minute-long assault captured on CCTV that he required a blood transfusion at the scene before being transported to hospital. Ross Monaghan, acquitted of Carroll's murder in 2010, was himself shot in 2017. The attack happened at the gates of St George's Primary School in the Penally area of Glasgow in January of that year, a gunman concealing a weapon inside a pram, pushing it to within range before firing. Monaghan was hit in the shoulder and survived. He moved subsequently to Spain, to the Costa del Sol, and his presence there would eventually intersect with the final chapter of the Lions organization's story in a way that no one in that Asda car park in January 2010 could have predicted. The Royston killing was tried twice, acquitted once and convicted once, and left the feud more deeply embedded than it had been before. Carroll's enforcer role within the Daniel organization passed to others after his death. His function, the collection of debts, the imposition of discipline, the communication of consequences, did not disappear with him. Organizations of that kind do not depend on individuals in that way, which is one of the structural reasons they persist. The specific person who had filled the role was gone. The role remained. The feud that killed him remained. The families that sustained it remained, on both sides, though both would change shape and geography significantly in the years that followed. Carroll himself became, in the memory of North Glasgow's criminal world, one of those names that the feud preserved in a particular way, as evidence of what it was capable of, in 25 seconds, on an ordinary Wednesday lunchtime. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Kevin Carroll was shot dead in 25 seconds, and the conviction for it took 5 years. The family his organization had been at war with for almost a decade would spend the years that followed growing outward, expanding from North Glasgow into Spain and the Gulf states, building connections to international cartels, and eventually attracting the attention of law enforcement agencies on 3 continents. Next, the Lions crime family, from Milton to Dubai to a beachside bar on the Costa del Sol. Section 7. The Lions crime family, from Milton to Bali. 2 families from the same North Glasgow postcode, spending 25 years trying to kill each other, is not, by itself, unusual in the context of organized crime. What made the Lions and Daniel feud different was its duration, its reach, and the degree to which it refused to stay contained within the geography that had produced it. It began on a few streets in Milton and Postle Park. It ended, most recently, with arrests in Dubai, a double murder on the Costa del Sol while 2 men watched a football match, and a crime boss, in orange overalls, being marched through Bali's International Arrivals Hall with his wrists bound in plastic cable ties. The distance between those 2 points is not just geographical. It is a measure of how completely the criminal economy that the Lions organization helped build had outgrown the city that gave it its first shape. Eddie Lyons Sr. founded the organization in the 1990s, building it from the Milton estate in North Glasgow, across a period when the drug trade was generating enough money in that part of the city to sustain serious criminal ambition. The Lyons and Daniel families lived in close proximity, their territories overlapping in ways that made confrontation inevitable once both organizations had grown large enough to feel the pressure of sharing the same market. The formal trigger for the feud was the 2001 theft of a £20,000 cocaine stash from a Daniel safe house in the north of the city, an act attributed to Lyons associates. But the conditions that made that theft possible, and that made the response to it so sustained and so violent, were older than any single incident. They were the conditions of 2 organizations that had grown up alongside each other in the same few streets, and had decided, at some point in the 1990s, that the space was not large enough for both of them. The feud remained largely underground through the early 2000s, generating violence that was real, but not consistently visible to the public eye. That changed in November 2006, when an event occurred that illustrated the register of hatred the conflict had reached by its 6th year. Kevin Carroll, the Daniel enforcer who would later be killed in the Asda car park at Royston, used a 4-wheel drive vehicle and a tow rope to topple the headstone on the grave of Gary Lyons, Eddie Sr.'s son, who had died of leukemia in 1991 at the age of 8. The desecration of a child's grave is not a tactical move in any conventional criminal calculus. It is a personal statement about the depth of the contempt one side holds for the other, about the willingness to go beyond the economic logic of the feud into something that can only be described as hatred. Within weeks, the Lions organization responded in kind. On a December evening in 2006, 2 men in long black coats and masks walked into the forecourt of Applero Motors on Balmore Road in Lamb Hill, a garage owned by David Lyons, Eddie Sr.'s brother. They were carrying handguns. David Lyons took cover as they opened fire. 3 men were shot. 21-year-old Michael Lyons, Eddie Sr.'s nephew, died at the scene. Stephen Lyons, who would later become the head of the organization, was wounded. A family associate named Robert Pickett, known as Piggy, was shot so severely that he lost a kidney. The two gunmen were identified as Raymond Anderson and James MacDonald, both members of the Daniel organization. They were convicted of the murder in 2008 and each sentenced to 35 years in prison, at the time the longest sentences in Scottish legal history. Stephen Lyons left Scotland for Spain within days of the Lamb shooting. He did not return. The response to the Lamb garage killing fed directly into the planning that produced the Rob Royston shooting of Carroll in January 2010, and the response to Carroll's death fed into the wave of violence that consumed the following 7 years. The feud had developed by that point into something that functioned with its own internal momentum, each act of violence generating an obligation on the other side that had to be discharged, a ledger of harm that both organizations maintained and consulted in determining what they owed and what they were owed. That logic is not irrational within its own frame. It is simply indifferent to everything outside that frame, including the people who happened to be nearby when the obligations were being settled. Ross Monaghan, acquitted of Carroll's murder in 2010, was shot at the gates of St George's Primary School in Penally in January 2017. The shooter had concealed a weapon inside a pram and pushed it to within range before opening fire. Monaghan was hit in the shoulder. He survived and moved to Spain. The shooting at the school gates during drop-off time, parents and children nearby, was the moment that prompted the intervention that eventually produced the 104-year sentence total of 2019. Police Scotland's Operation Engagement was already tracking the Lyons network when the next sequence of attacks began. Between June 2016 and September 2017, 6 Lyons associates carried out or coordinated a series of attempted murders targeting 5 men connected to the Daniel organization. The targets were Robert Daniel, Thomas Bilsland, Gary Petty, Ryan Fitzsimmons, and Stephen Bonzo Daniel. The methods included tracking devices fitted to vehicles, coordinated surveillance of movements, high-speed vehicle interceptions, and bladed weapons used at close range. Robert Daniel's car was rammed on the 8th of December 2016 before he was chased into a house in Rob Royston and struck on the head. Ryan Fitzsimmons, described in court as a hard-working man living peacefully with his mother, was attacked and sustained injuries severe enough to require extensive medical treatment. The most violent incident of the sequence was the attack on Stephen Daniel on the 18th of May 2017. After a chase reaching 100 miles per hour through North Glasgow's Milton area, Daniel crashed his Skoda Octavia on an approach road to the M8 motorway and lost consciousness behind the wheel. His attackers, who had fitted his car with a tracking device and followed it, arrived at the wreck and attacked him with a cleaver and a hammer. His nose was almost completely severed from his face. Police who arrived at the scene initially believed from the nature of the injuries that he had been shot at close range rather than cut. The Audi S3 used in the attack was found burned out afterward. A bloodied machete was recovered from its back seat. The 6 men convicted following the 14-week trial at the High Court in Glasgow were Brian Ferguson, Andrew Gallagher, Robert Pickett, Andrew Sinclair, John Hardy, and Peter Bain. Pickett was the same man who had survived the Lamb garage shooting in 2006 and lost a kidney. He had been released, resumed his involvement with the Lyons organization, and was now standing in the dock alongside 5 others for conspiracy to murder. Ferguson, Gallagher, and Hardy each received 20 years. Pickett received 16. Bain received 15. Sinclair received 13 years and 3 months. The combined total was 104 years. Lord Mulholland, sentencing them, told the 6 men that they had sought to turn Glasgow into a war zone. He said there was no place for their conduct, their retribution, or the law of the jungle in a civilized country built on the rule of law. As the men were led down to the cells, Gallagher made a clenched fist gesture. Ferguson appeared to salute someone in the public gallery. Bain grinned and gave a thumbs up. Police described it as a miracle that none of the 5 targets had been killed. Stephen Lyons had been in Dubai through much of this period, having settled there after leaving Spain, following a path well established by other European organized crime figures seeking a base from which to manage international operations at a distance from the jurisdictions where they were known and wanted. In Dubai, he developed connections with the Kinahan organized crime group, the Dublin-originated cartel that had itself moved to the Gulf state and had attracted a $5 million bounty from the United States Drug Enforcement Agency. Sources close to the investigation indicated that Lyons and Daniel Kinahan had developed a working relationship during the period. Both were based on the Costa del Sol, and that the alliance gave the Lions organization access to supply networks and international reach that a purely Glasgow-based operation could never have generated independently. That access was part of what allowed the Lions organization to continue functioning and generating revenue even as its street-level network in North Glasgow was being dismantled by successive prosecutions. The violence that erupted across Glasgow and Edinburgh from March 2025, which police responded to with Operation Portaledge, created a new dynamic. A falling out between a Lions associate named Ross McGill and Edinburgh cocaine dealer Mark Richardson triggered a sequence of shootings, machete attacks, property firebombings, and arsons that spread across the Central Belt. McGill, formerly a senior figure in the Rangers Ultras group the Union Bears, had emerged as a significant figure in the criminal network operating from Dubai. Over 60 people were arrested under Operation Portaledge as the violence spread and escalated. The trigger for the feud's latest chapter had shifted from the Daniel Lyons axis to a dispute over a drug transaction. But the infrastructure of violence that the Lions organization had built and maintained over 2 decades was what gave the escalation its scale. On the 31st of May 2025, Eddie Lyons Jr., 46 years old and Stephen Lyons' brother, was at Monaghan's Bar in Fuengirola on the Costa del Sol watching the UEFA Champions League final. Ross Monaghan, 44, who had been acquitted of Kevin Carroll's murder 15 years earlier and shot at a school gate 8 years before that, was with him. A lone gunman entered the bar and shot both men dead. Spanish police identified a 44-year-old man from Liverpool named Michael Riley as the principal suspect for the killings. A full extradition hearing was scheduled. Spanish police sources told reporters that a member of the Daniel clan was involved in commissioning the assassinations, though Police Scotland stated publicly that the Fuengirola killings were not directly linked to the ongoing Operation Portaledge investigation. The bar where the 2 men were killed bore Monaghan's own surname on its sign. 4 months after the Fuengirola killings, in September 2025, Dubai police arrested Stephen Lyons alongside Ross McGill, Stephen Jameson, and Stephen Larwood in a joint operation with Scottish and Emirati authorities. All 4 were released in October and told to leave the UAE immediately. Jameson was subsequently extradited to Scotland and appeared at Glasgow Sheriff Court, facing charges including directing serious organised crime. The others dispersed. On the 31st of March 2026, Stephen Lyons was arrested at Igusti Ngurah Rai Airport in Bali, Indonesia. He had been on Spain's wanted list for approximately 2 years, connected to a 2024 murder case. Bali's police chief told reporters that Lyons was alleged to be the leader of a large-scale transnational criminal organisation engaged in drug trafficking and money laundering across Spain, Scotland, England, Dubai, Qatar, Bahrain, and Turkey. Lyons was photographed in orange overalls with his wrists bound in cable ties, escorted by Indonesian officers. He was deported to Spain to face proceedings there. The Lyons crime family, from its origins in Milton in the 1990s to its current dispersal across Spanish courtrooms, Bali immigration offices, and the continuing Operation Portaledge investigation, represents the fullest expression of what the globalization of the drug trade meant for Glasgow's criminal organizations. Eddie Lyons Sr. built something from the north of a single Scottish city. His son Stephen turned it into an operation that could sustain itself from Dubai and required the combined resources of Scottish, Spanish, Indonesian, and Emirati law enforcement to bring to any kind of reckoning. The feud that produced 104 years of combined sentences in 2019 and 2 bodies in a Costa del Sol bar in 2025 began with a £20,000 cocaine stash stolen from a Milton safe house. It has not ended. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Lions organization expanded from Glasgow to Dubai and Bali. The next organization in this list went further still, and in a different direction. Not upward into international crime alliances, but inward, building an encrypted infrastructure so sophisticated it attracted the attention of the FBI, the DEA, and the Brazilian Federal Police. Next, the Gillespie brothers and Operation Escalade, the most prolific organised crime network Scotland has ever produced. Section 8. The Gillespie brothers. Operation Escalade encryption is a tool with entirely legitimate uses, and the company that James and Barry Gillespie built to supply it was registered and operational and presented itself to the world as a commercial enterprise. Mobile privacy company known as MPC sold handsets to customers who wanted their communications to remain private. The phones ran a specially commissioned operating system that the brothers had hired developers to build after deciding that an existing encrypted network, Enetcom, was not sufficient for their purposes. The Gillespies had started with that platform, then concluded that they needed something they owned and controlled entirely, something whose architecture they understood completely and whose vulnerability points they could manage themselves. The logic was sound. If the security of your communications depends on a third-party system, you are dependent on that third party's operational security, as well as your own. Building your own removes that dependency. It also, as Scottish police and eventually the FBI and DEA came to understand, makes you a harder target. MPC's clients were, by the assessment of law enforcement, criminals. The company's phones existed to serve the drug trade, the arms trade, and the financial infrastructure that supported both. The Gillespies built it, ran it, and used it as the nervous system of what detectives described as Scotland's most prolific and most profitable organised crime network. James Gillespie and his brother Barry came from Rutherglen, a town immediately southeast of Glasgow that sits within the wider urban area of the city, without quite being part of it. James was the elder, in his mid-40s by the time the investigation into the network had reached its most public phase. Barry was 4 years younger. The operation they built, referred to by Police Scotland as the Escalade Group, and given that name through the investigation that eventually pursued it, generated more than £100 million per year at its peak by the estimates of senior detectives. It stretched, as one investigating officer put it, from Baillieston in Glasgow's East End to Brazil. That description is not metaphorical. The organisation had active operations, associates, and supply chains on multiple continents simultaneously. The brothers sat at the top of it and, for the most significant part of its active life, did so from abroad. The street-level evidence of the network's reach had been accumulating for years before Operation Escalade formally began in 2014. Sources told police and journalists that it would have been difficult to find a single gram of cocaine in Scotland that the Gillespies had not profited from, that their stranglehold on the supply chain was total enough to give them an effective monopoly over the Scottish market at the top tier. A source at the time described their position as comparable in structural terms to the South American narco networks, though operating at a smaller absolute scale. That comparison, made by someone with direct knowledge of the operation, gives a sense of what investigators were looking at. Not a criminal enterprise that happened to sell drugs, but an enterprise built around drug supply, with the same commercial discipline and market control that distinguishes a dominant business from a participant in a competitive market. The most detailed public picture of how the network operated came from the trial and conviction of its 9 ground-level members in 2018, who were jailed at the High Court in Glasgow for a combined total of 87 years. The 9 included Gerard Docherty, Stephen McArdle, Francis Mulligan, David Sell, and Barry O'Neill, along with a figure whose biography set him apart from the others, Martin Fitzsimmons, a former soldier who had used his military position to steal ammunition and explosives and channel them to the Gillespie network. Fitzsimmons had left the armed forces and then leveraged the access and knowledge his service had given him to supply a criminal organisation with materiel that the organisation could not easily obtain otherwise. He was also among the accused named in connection with the 2017 primary school shooting of Ross Monaghan, a charge that was among those listed in the original 28-count indictment, though the case proceeded on reduced charges. Among the 9 was also Mark Richardson, an Edinburgh-based cocaine dealer whose subsequent activities would eventually become one of the triggers for the 2025 Glasgow-Edinburgh gang war that produced Operation Portaledge. The crimes documented in the 87-year sentencing included the torture of a man over an unpaid cocaine debt, described by the prosecution as merciless, and a large cache of weapons discovered concealed in a vehicle. The network had used those weapons both to enforce its drug distribution arrangements and, through Fitzsimmons and others, to supply arms to external clients. The business of arming other criminal organisations, as a service separate from the drug trade but running alongside it, represents a level of operational sophistication that is relatively rare in British organised crime. The Gillespie network was not simply a drug supply operation. It was a criminal enterprise that sold violence, in the form of weapons and enforcement, as a distinct product line. Their victims were documented in court with the specificity that large criminal enterprises tend to generate once investigators have broken open the communication records. Robert Allen was abducted from his home in Barnsley, taken across the country to be kneecapped in a 2-day ordeal, and subsequently found in East Kilbride, where he had been shot 3 times. The allegation was that Alan had fled Scotland over a drug debt and that the Gillespie organisation had located him and applied consequences. He was found by members of the public. The brothers were wanted in connection with that attack, as well as with the murder of a Glasgow drug dealer named Martin Toner in 2004. European arrest warrants were issued. Both brothers had already gone. They had moved first to Portugal's Algarve, presenting themselves as property developers, before cutting contact and disappearing from the European law enforcement network entirely. Police Scotland eventually developed intelligence placing them in Brazil, in the coastal city of Fortaleza, where they were living in a 420 square metre apartment overlooking the Praia do Meireles beach, at a monthly rental of approximately £3,200. The apartment was 4 times the size of the average Glasgow flat. They posed as wealthy tourists. James operated under the name James Gardner. Barry used the name Eamon Fitzpatrick. They maintained contact with family and associates through the encrypted infrastructure they had themselves built, the MPC phones that had been designed precisely for this kind of continued operation from concealment. Crime Stoppers posted a reward of £5,000 for each brother. The reward was later withdrawn without either man being brought back to Scotland. The intelligence that came back from Brazil, through the Brazilian Federal Police, and through the underworld sources that police sometimes depend on in cases where conventional surveillance has no clear path, was that the brothers had entered into a dispute with local criminal interests over protection money. Fortaleza is not a neutral space for foreign organised crime figures seeking to operate quietly. Brazilian organised crime networks, some of them extremely violent and well-structured, regard foreign presence in their territory as either a business opportunity or a threat, and the assessment of how a given foreigner should be categorised is made quickly and without appeal. The Gillespies, according to sources speaking to Scottish investigators and journalists, fell into the wrong category. Police Scotland eventually told the families that they believed the brothers may have come to harm. The language was careful, and the conclusion it implied was not. Sources close to the investigation described the brothers as having been executed by Brazilian gangsters following the protection money dispute. Their bodies have not been found. No deaths have been formally confirmed. The case remains technically open. James White had been a senior member of the Gillespie network throughout the period of its most active operation. He was from Gartcosh in Lanarkshire and had worked at a level of the organisation close enough to the Gillespies that when they disappeared into Brazil and ceased to function as operational leaders, he continued the network in their absence. His EncroChat handle was the Don. The name reflected something real about his position in the structure. White directed drug importation at industrial scale, organised the financial infrastructure that laundered what the drugs generated, and maintained the operational security that had kept the network functioning across multiple jurisdictions for nearly a decade. His methods were documented in extraordinary detail by the EncroChat intercepts that French law enforcement obtained by penetrating the encrypted platform in 2020, providing investigators across Europe and beyond with a window into criminal communications that had previously been inaccessible. The intercepts connected White to a £10 million cocaine seizure that Border Force teams had made in November 2017 when they stopped a lorry at Dover that had originated in Alicante in Spain. The lorry was addressed to a fictitious company that the network had established in Rochdale in Greater Manchester. Hidden spaces had been constructed inside the vehicle to conceal 90 taped blocks of cocaine. Investigators established that 16 similar shipments to the Rochdale address had been made across the 2 years preceding the seizure. White was also linked through EncroChat messages to the gang's second major supply route, which involved a fake company called Adastra Off-Grid, presenting as a solar panel business, whose product moved cocaine and cannabis concealed inside specially engineered panel cavities. A police raid on a unit in London found panels with voids of exactly that kind. Paul Fleming, White's right-hand man and the figure investigators described as the captain of the operation's logistics wing, communicated with White through EncroChat as lorry loads moved through Border Force's Green Lane, the low-scrutiny channel introduced to accelerate food imports. The message thread in which Fleming described the ease of the movements, and White responded that he felt like adding another 100 kilograms to the next shipment, was read to the court at the High Court in Stirling during Fleming's sentencing. Fleming was arrested by Spanish authorities in Alicante in June 2022 and extradited to Scotland in March 2023. He was sentenced to 9 years at the High Court in Stirling, Lord Colbeck telling him the offence was of the utmost seriousness. White himself was arrested in June 2020 in Fortaleza by the Brazilian Federal Police, working jointly with Police Scotland, at rented accommodation in the same city where the Gillespies had last been seen alive. He was operating under the name Vincent McCall, listing his nationality as Surinamese. A European arrest warrant had been issued for him in 2018. He was extradited to Scotland in August 2022, 2 years after his arrest. On the 30th of June 2023, at the High Court in Glasgow, he pleaded guilty to directing serious organised crime, importing and supplying controlled drugs, possessing firearms and explosives, and money laundering. He was sentenced to 9 years and 10 months. Lord Colbeck noted that for nearly a decade, White had been a senior member of an organisation that operated not just in Scotland and England, but in Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, France, Russia, and the United Arab Emirates. The proceeds of crime assessment that followed the conviction produced a figure so large that Crown lawyers described it as potentially the largest sum ever sought in a Scottish proceeds of crime hearing. The estimate placed White's benefit from criminal conduct at £126,241,001. The precision of that final figure, to the last pound, was the product of the forensic accounting that investigators had applied to a decade of financial records, EncroChat messages, bank accounts, property purchases, and cash movements. A confiscation order to recover that sum was sought. The organisation that had generated it no longer existed in the form it had taken during its active years, its leadership dead or imprisoned, its communication infrastructure penetrated, its supply chains disrupted across multiple jurisdictions. Gerard McTaggart, 47 years old and described in court as a wages paymaster for elite gangland figures and their families, was jailed for 4 years and 8 months in August 2023, after surveillance officers filmed him delivering bags containing thousands of pounds in cash to several locations linked to the Escalade Group. John Gray, of Paisley, who had been connected to the Gillespie brothers and a £14 million drug operation, was arrested at Glasgow Airport in March 2026 as he stepped off a plane, convicted on the 18th of May 2026 of serious organised crime offences relating to a period spanning August 2015 to June 2020. His encrypted phone records placed him meeting senior Escalade figures in Glasgow city centre and a KFC in Wishaw in 2015, and handling arrangements for cocaine valued between £4.5 million and £13.5 million across the following 5 years. Operation Escalade had, by early 2023, produced convictions against 42 individuals and extradited 8 fugitives from across Europe and South America. Police Scotland announced at that point that they were working with the United States Drug Enforcement Agency and the FBI on the next phase. The DEA and FBI do not involve themselves in Scottish criminal investigations as a matter of routine. Their presence in the next phase of Escalade indicates something about the scale of what remained unresolved: international supply chains, financial flows across multiple continents, and connections to criminal networks far larger than anything Glasgow had produced on its own. The Gillespie brothers, dead or alive in a shallow grave in Brazil, had built something that outlasted them, and that required 3 countries' worth of law enforcement to pull apart. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Gillespie network generated over £100 million a year and stretched from Glasgow to Brazil. The next figure in this list operated at a comparable scale through a different method: not encrypted phones and international logistics, but a ton of cocaine packed into boxes of bananas from Ecuador, intercepted at Dover, and traced back to a man running a pill factory in Kent while jogging in the grounds of a Glasgow Castle hotel. Next, Jamie Iceman Stevenson. Section 9. Jamie Stevenson. The Iceman Border Force officers at the port of Dover began searching a refrigerated cargo of bananas from Ecuador on a September day in 2020 and spent 3 days working through it before they found all of what was hidden inside. The boxes were branded Calypso, standard commercial produce packaging, addressed to Glasgow Fruit Market Limited, at a warehouse in Townhead in Glasgow's city centre. Inside the green fruit, wrapped in foil and packed in blocks, were 119 packages containing 952 kilograms of cocaine. The purity of the drug was 73%. The National Crime Agency estimated its street value at £100 million. It was the largest drug seizure in Scottish criminal history up to that point, and the man who had organised the shipment was, by the time investigators had worked through the evidence and identified him, one of the most familiar names in Scottish law enforcement. Jamie Stevenson, from Rutherglen, known to police for 20 years before the banana boxes arrived at Dover, known to his associates by the nickname that had followed him his entire criminal life, the Iceman. He had grown up in a poor part of Glasgow and built his reputation from the bottom of the criminal economy upward, through the same progression of violence and association that produced most of the senior organised crime figures in the city during the 1980s and 1990s. His physique, stocky and solid in a way that made him physically imposing well into his 50s, had earned him a secondary nickname in the streets around Rutherglen, the Bull. He carried a scar on the left side of his face. He did not move through Glasgow unnoticed by people who knew what they were looking at, and most of the people around him did. Among those people was Tony McGovern, a crime boss based in Springburn 2 miles from Rutherglen, whose organisation was one of the significant drug distribution networks in the north of the city. Stevenson and McGovern were not rivals. They were, for a sustained period through the 1990s, close enough friends that McGovern was Stevenson's best man at his wedding. On the 24th of May 2000, Tony McGovern was shot dead outside a pub in Glasgow. He was 34 years old. The investigation into his murder focused quickly on Stevenson as the principal suspect. The precise nature of whatever had passed between the two men, to turn a close friendship into something fatal, was never established in public proceedings. Stevenson was charged with murder. In 2001, the case was dropped due to a lack of evidence. He walked out of court. In the days following McGovern's death, sources told investigators and journalists that Stevenson had begun photographing other members of the McGovern family as they went about their daily movements, and had then arranged for those photographs to be delivered to the relevant individuals. The message those deliveries carried was precise and required no written explanation. He knew where they went and when. He was making sure they knew that he knew. McGovern's organisation, which had been operating in Springburn for years, did not attempt to retaliate in any documented or prosecuted way. Stevenson had communicated his capability and his intent with an efficiency that made further communication unnecessary. The period between McGovern's murder and Stevenson's first significant conviction is one of the most productive phases of his criminal career in purely financial terms, even if the law failed for years to reach it. He was operating at volume in the cocaine and heroin markets, generating money that moved through legitimate business fronts and into assets that gave the income a plausible appearance of legitimacy. One of those fronts was a taxi firm, another was a watch collection. When Police Scotland, following one of the largest undercover surveillance operations in Scottish history to that point, finally built a case against him, what they could prosecute was the laundering rather than the underlying drug trade. In April 2007, at the High Court in Glasgow, Stevenson pleaded guilty to laundering more than £1 million of criminal funds. The method documented in court included channeling money through the taxi firm and using criminal proceeds to purchase 55 luxury watches. He was jailed for 13 years. The judge described him as a major figure in serious organised crime. He was released in 2013 or 2014, the sentence having been served in part, and he returned to Rutherglen. The 13-year sentence and the years of surveillance that produced it did not slow the operation, it paused it. Stevenson was back at work within a relatively short period of his release, rebuilding connections and supply lines with the same methodical discipline that had characterized the earlier phase of his career. What had changed in the intervening years was the scale at which the drug economy operated and the technological infrastructure available to serious criminals. Encrypted communication platforms, particularly EncroChat, had become the standard for high-level drug trafficking across Europe. The platform had been developed precisely to prevent law enforcement from accessing the communications of its users, and for a period, it achieved that purpose. Stevenson adopted it. He communicated with his network through EncroChat. His messages on the platform would, in the end, form a significant part of the evidence against him, because French law enforcement had spent years working to penetrate it, and in 2020 they succeeded. The Etisalam operation became visible to investigators before the banana box cocaine surfaced, and its scale was sufficient on its own to qualify as one of the most significant drug manufacturing operations Scottish criminal history had recorded. Etisalam, sold on the streets of Scottish cities as street Valium, is a sedative whose unregulated use had by 2020 become one of the primary drivers of drug deaths in Scotland. The country's drug mortality rate was, during that period, the worst in Europe. It was not a coincidence that Stevenson had chosen to manufacture Etisalam at scale. The demand was established, the supply chains were manageable, and the legal framework around the drug in Scotland was sufficiently complex to make prosecution harder than it would have been for Class A substances in standard form. The factory that police found in Kent in June 2020, following a raid coordinated across multiple agencies, contained approximately 28 million etizolaam tablets in various stages of production. The volume was enough to have generated a significant proportion of the street Valium circulating in Scottish cities over a period of months. On the 12th of June 2020, the same day that police executed the Kent raid, officers in Glasgow observed Stevenson at a picnic table in the grounds of the Sherbrooke Castle Hotel in the Corkerhill area of the city's south side. He was meeting associates. The Sherbrooke Castle, a Victorian baronial building that operates as a hotel and wedding venue, provided a setting that was sufficiently public to suggest ordinary life and sufficiently spacious to allow private conversation. The irony of the location, a castle hotel converted to commercial hospitality, used as a meeting point for a discussion of international cocaine importation, was not noted in court but tends to register for anyone following the details. Officers moved to arrest him. Stevenson was apprehended approximately 100 yards from the hotel. He was carrying a mobile device running EncroChat. He was arrested, taken south to answer questions in connection with the Kent factory, and then released on bail. He used that bail to leave the country. He did not return for 20 months. The banana box cocaine seizure happened in September 2020, while he was already outside the jurisdiction, and while the investigation into his activity was accumulating evidence on multiple fronts. In January 2022, the National Crime Agency named him publicly as one of 12 individuals on their priority most wanted list, men they described as believed to be hiding in Spain. The NCA and Police Scotland stated jointly that they would not rest until his capture. Weeks after the public appeal, surveillance teams operating with Dutch National Police tracked him to Bergen-op-Zoom, a municipality in the south of the Netherlands. On a midday in February 2022, a Dutch tactical unit arrested him while he was running. He was jogging in the street when they reached him. Dean Ferguson, 28 years old, who was wanted by Police Scotland on separate matters, was arrested at the same location. Stevenson was taken into custody, and extradition proceedings began. The picture of him that reached the public after the arrest was the police mugshot that had been circulated during the most wanted appeal. Fair hair greying at the sides, white t-shirt, looking directly at the camera with the particular expression of a man who has been photographed by police enough times to have decided not to give the moment anything. He was extradited and returned to Scotland to face trial at the High Court in Glasgow. The trial that opened addressed charges spanning both the etizolaam factory and the cocaine importation, as well as connected offences including arson. Stevenson initially denied 14 charges across the indictment, submitting a special defence of incrimination against Lloyd Cross, one of his co-accused, and another man. Cross was the owner of LM Recovery, a vehicle recovery business, whose fleet and cash flow had been used to fund the drug importation and to move money between the people running it. A Glasgow fruit market trader named David Bilsland had met Stevenson at a hotel in Alicante on Valentine's Day, the 14th of February 2020, with Spanish police conducting surveillance outside. The meeting was the planning session for the banana box operation. Bilsland's legitimate connection to the fruit trade had provided the cover that the shipment required: a real trading name, a real address at a real market, a plausible reason for boxes of bananas to arrive addressed to a Glasgow business. The prosecution's narrative described the potential profits from the scheme as having been described to Stevenson in messages as life-changing. On the fifth day of the trial, Stevenson entered guilty pleas. He admitted directing the importation and supply of cocaine, directing the etizolaam manufacturing operation, and possessing criminal funds transmitted through encrypted devices. The other members of his gang were dealt with separately. Gerard Carbin and Ryan McPhee had pleaded guilty on day 3. Lewis Connor, 27 years old, was jailed for 3 years after encrypted phone records established that he had set fire to properties and vehicles across central Scotland on behalf of the network. The combined sentences for the gang totaled 29 years, alongside whatever was handed down to Stevenson himself. Lord Eric sentenced Jamie Stevenson to 20 years imprisonment at the High Court in Glasgow in October 2024. In passing sentence, the judge noted that Stevenson had directed an operation of the utmost seriousness, one that had spanned multiple countries and multiple criminal markets simultaneously, and that he had returned to organised crime at the highest level within a short period of his previous release. Stevenson's legal team appealed. The Court of Appeal in Edinburgh subsequently reduced the sentence to 16 years, concluding that the original 20-year term had been disproportionate given the guilty plea and other relevant factors. The reduction produced some comment in legal circles and considerable comment outside them. Stevenson was 59 at the time of sentencing, which meant that even at 16 years, assuming standard early release provisions, the sentence represented a substantial portion of whatever criminal operating life remained available to him. The 952 blocks of cocaine inside those Calypso banana boxes represented, in physical terms, the most visible single artifact of a career that had produced 30 years of damage across Glasgow and beyond, the drug deaths in which Etisalam had played a role, the violence connected to McGovern's murder and its aftermath, the money laundered through watches and taxis, and the supply chains connecting Glasgow's housing estates to Ecuador through Spain and Abu Dhabi. The blocks had been packed carefully in foil, placed inside the boxes alongside actual bananas that had begun to ripen during their journey across the Atlantic, and sent north to a city where the demand for them had been established and maintained over years by an infrastructure Stevenson had built and run with a consistency that no court had managed to interrupt for more than 7 years at a stretch. It took 3 days at Dover to find them all. It took 20 years of police work to find him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Jamie Stevenson is serving 16 years for a cocaine operation that spanned 4 countries and took 20 years of police work to close. The final section of this video steps back from individual cases and looks at what the full list of men in this video represents, the pattern underneath the violence, the city that produced them, and the question of what Glasgow's criminal landscape looks like now. Section 10. Ian McAteer. Mad Jock Liverpool and Glasgow do not share a border. They share something more durable, a supply chain. The motorway between them, the M6 cutting south from the Central Belt through the industrial Midlands toward Merseyside, carried legitimate freight in both directions for decades. It also, from roughly the early 1990s onward, carried heroin. The drug came in from Amsterdam, moved through Liverpool's established import infrastructure, and then headed north to Glasgow, where the demand had been created through the 1980s by the collapse of the city's industrial economy and cemented by the street-level distribution networks that men like Arthur Thompson had helped to build. The route was logical. Liverpool had the port connections, the supply relationships, and the criminal infrastructure to move product at volume. Glasgow had the market. What the route needed to function reliably across 200 miles and 2 cities with their own separate territorial logics was someone who could operate credibly in both places simultaneously. Ian McAteer was that person for the better part of a decade. He was born in November 1961 in Dalmuir in Clydebank, just west of Glasgow, and grew up splitting time between Dalmuir and Easterhouse and Drumchapel, 2 of Glasgow's most economically marginalised housing schemes. His criminal career, by the account of investigative journalist Graham Johnson, who documented it in detail, began in 1979 when he was 17, initially through petty crime, before expanding into drug dealing, arms trading, debt collection, and protection. The legitimate cover he maintained throughout his active years was a used car business on Burns Street in Glasgow. Used car dealing has served as cover for criminal operations in Glasgow since before Thompson retired to the Ponderosa, and for the same structural reason: cash transactions, fluctuating valuations, a plausible explanation for the movement of money between buyers, sellers, and intermediaries. McAteer's cars were real. They were sold. The money that moved through the business alongside the car sales was not from cars. His English associates called him Mad Jock. The nickname communicated what they needed it to communicate: that he was Scottish, that he was unpredictable in a way that crossed cultural expectations even in criminal company, and that the unpredictability was a feature rather than a liability. Among Glasgow criminals he was known additionally as Little Hands, a reference to his physical build that made no judgment on his capability. Both names circulated widely enough that they appear without attribution across criminal intelligence records and journalistic accounts from the period of his most active operation. He was stocky, aggressive, and by the accounts of people who dealt with him, genuinely frightening in a register that went beyond performance. The men who worked for him understood that the risk of crossing him was real and immediate. The men who crossed him found out precisely how real. His first major legal encounter came in 1985 with a robbery conviction that produced 5 years and 4 months. He served the sentence, emerged, and continued. In 1993, while in possession of what court documents described as an abundance of recreational drugs, he was arrested and brought before the High Court in Glasgow. He chose to represent himself at trial. The decision reflected either extraordinary confidence or a calculation that a professional legal representation offered no particular advantage in his circumstances. The jury convicted him regardless. He received 5 years. He served it. While inside, he met a Liverpudlian named Warren Selkirk, a drug dealer with the Merseyside connections that McAteer needed to formalise and expand the supply route he had been developing informally for years. They formed an arrangement. Selkirk would be a courier and eventually a partner. The arrangement would, 7 years later, end with Selkirk shot 5 times in the head and chest beside a marina on the Merseyside coast, while his 2 young sons waited for him in a car. He also, while serving that sentence, developed a conflict with another prisoner named Jack Bennett. The nature of the original dispute was not fully documented in subsequent court proceedings, but its consequences were extremely well documented. On the 28th of February 1998, following both men's release from prison, Bennett was attacked in daylight on Royston Road in Glasgow. He was stabbed 57 times. The number of wounds tells the same story as the nail through the debtor's floor, or the bag of dog mess left in a dead man's hand. It is a statement about contempt, about the depth of the feeling behind the act, about the desire to communicate something beyond the killing itself. 57 stab wounds is not a fight that escalated. It is an instruction delivered at great length to whoever found the body and to whoever in Glasgow's criminal world was paying attention. McAteer, along with 2 other men, Robert Burke and Donald MacPhail, stood trial for the Bennett murder. The prosecution presented evidence that McAteer had put out a contract on Bennett while both were still inside, offering 2 ounces of tobacco and 50 temazepam tablets to any inmate who would carry it out. The currency of that offer, tobacco and sedatives rather than money, tells a story about the internal economy of Scottish prisons in the mid-1990s and about the particular economy of leverage and obligation that a man with McAteer's standing could mobilise even from a prison cell. The contract had been accepted. Bennett had been killed. On the 10th of August 1998, the jury returned not proven verdicts on all 3 accused. McAteer walked out of the High Court and went back to work. Later that same year, he was arrested in Merseyside on suspicion of shooting a man at a set of traffic lights in Glasgow. The incident had taken place a short distance from where Bennett had been killed on Royston Road. The victim declined to make a formal complaint. No charges followed. The 2 incidents within 1 year, the not proven murder verdict and the shooting that produced no complainant, demonstrate with unusual clarity the difficulty that law enforcement faced in building sustainable cases against men of McAteer's standing. The problem was not that investigators lacked suspicions or that the criminal world lacked knowledge of what he had done. The problem was that the people with the most direct knowledge had strong reasons not to share it with anyone holding a police notebook. The heroin operation was the most significant part of his activity by the late 1990s in terms of both volume and revenue. Investigators who eventually documented it placed the monthly throughput at 20 to 30 kilograms, moving from Amsterdam through Liverpool to Glasgow. The route worked through the supply infrastructure that Liverpool's criminal network had built over years of importing at volume, with McAteer providing the Glasgow end, the buyers, the distribution network, and the money that came back down the M6 after the product had moved north. At 6 kilograms per courier trip, each individual movement was worth several £100,000 at wholesale prices. At 20 to 30 kilograms a month, the monthly revenue was substantial enough that Glasgow sources speaking to journalists described it as enough to make McAteer one of the most significant heroin distributors in Scotland through the mid to late 1990s. Warren Selkirk, the Liverpudlian he had met in prison and recruited as a courier, became more deeply embedded in the operation after his release. He moved product. He was trusted with money. He was, from McAteer's perspective, a useful man in a position where useful men were a finite resource. What changed between Selkirk's recruitment and his death is not fully documented in any public account, but the inference from subsequent events is that money became an issue. Drug trafficking relationships at any level of the supply chain eventually produce disputes over payment, over quantities, over margins. When those disputes arise between parties who do not have access to legal mechanisms for resolution, the available options are limited. McAteer's preferred option, evidenced across his career, was the kind of definitive resolution that required no follow-up. On the 30th of October, 1999, Warren Selkirk was at Crosby Marina on the Merseyside coast. His two sons, aged 10 and 14, were waiting in a car nearby. A gunman approached and shot Selkirk 4 times in the head and face, and once in the chest. The body was found with a bag of dog mess placed in the dead man's hand, an expression of contempt identical in spirit to the 57 stab wounds on Royston Road the previous year. McAteer had a language of post-mortem communication, and he used it consistently. Selkirk died of his wounds. His sons were close enough to the scene to understand immediately what had happened to their father. McAteer was arrested and charged with Selkirk's murder, as well as with the heroin trafficking operation that investigators had been building a case around for years. The trial was held at Liverpool Crown Court rather than in Scotland, because the murder had occurred in Merseyside and because the drug trafficking charges were anchored to Liverpool's supply infrastructure. He stood in the dock and described himself as a used car dealer. He denied any involvement in Selkirk's killing. He denied involvement in heroin trafficking. The key Crown witness against him was George Bell Smith, a drug courier who had worked inside the operation and who told the jury that he had seen McAteer with a handgun in a hotel room on the night before Selkirk was killed. The jury deliberated for more than 7 hours. They convicted him of murder by an 11-1 majority. They also convicted him unanimously of conspiring with Selkirk and others to traffic heroin from Liverpool to Glasgow. He received a life sentence for the murder. A 5-year concurrent term followed for perverting the course of justice through the construction of a false alibi. A 16-year concurrent term was added for the drug trafficking. At the Royal Courts of Justice in London in 2006, following a review of the tariff, Justice Grigson set the minimum term he must serve before becoming eligible for parole at 22.5 years. He had by that point been inside for 5 years. The arithmetic was straightforward. He would not be eligible for parole consideration until at least 2023 at the earliest, and that was assuming no further legal complications. He was 61 at that point. In 2011, a notice appeared in the Scottish media about a charity event at HMP Shotts in North Lanarkshire. 2 inmates had run a marathon on treadmills in the prison gym and raised £3,776 for Glasgow's Royal Hospital for Sick Children. One of the inmates was Jamie Stevenson, the Iceman, whose banana box cocaine conviction would not come until more than a decade later. The other was Ian McAteer. Jack Bennett's sister contacted journalists when the story ran. She called the fundraising effort a con. She maintained her belief, never resolved in any courtroom, that McAteer was responsible for the 57 stab wounds that had killed her brother on Royston Road 13 years earlier. The charity money went to the Children's Hospital regardless. The not-proven verdict on Jack Bennett has never been revisited. His name also appeared, during the period of investigation into the April 1999 murder of television presenter Jill Dando, on a list of individuals that Metropolitan Police detectives were asked to consider as potential suspects or connections. The investigation into Dando's killing considered a range of theories, including the possibility that organized criminal networks with a connection to Eastern European operations that Dando had worked on were involved in the shooting. McAteer's cross-border connections and his established criminality made him a figure that investigators in that period felt the need to look at. No evidence connected him to the crime. No charges were ever brought against him in relation to it. Barry George was convicted of the killing in 2001 and acquitted on retrial in 2008. The murder of Jill Dando remains officially unsolved. McAteer's name appears in that history only as one of many threads that investigators followed and were unable to connect to what happened outside her home in Fulham. What remains settled is the conviction and the sentence. A Glasgow man who built a heroin distribution route from Amsterdam through Liverpool to Scotland, who accumulated 2 separate not-proven murder verdicts before being convicted of a third killing, who ran his operation across 2 criminal underworlds for the better part of 20 years, and who was finally brought down not by Scottish investigators but by a Merseyside jury, persuaded 11-1 by the account of a drug courier who had watched him holding a weapon the night before a man was found shot dead at a marina with a bag of dog mess in his hand. Mad Jock from Dalmuir and Easterhouse, operational across a 200-mile corridor of British criminality, is still in prison. The route between Liverpool and Glasgow is still there. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.